This episode of My Weird Record Collection discusses one or more records that have political content. Having said that, nothing said in this episode, or any other episode of this podcast for that matter, should ever be interpreted as promotion, rejection, or mockery of any political views or lack thereof.
Gentlemen, get the thing straight once and for all. The policeman isn't there to create disorder. The policeman is there to preserve disorder.
Welcome, my friends, to episode number 16th of My Weird Record Collection. My name is Sean, and I'm coming to you from the city of Chicago, and I hereby invite you to my odd world of strange, miscellaneous, and otherwise uncategorizable media for that turntable of yours. Before we get into anything, though, there's one addendum I have for the previous episode, episode 15, in which I talked about Bob's Marriage Repair Kit by the Reverend Bob Harrington. It's very short and simple. I failed to mention that at one point, many, if not all, of Bob's records were released on compact disc, so you could get Bob Harrington digitally. Modern times, aren't they wonderful? Also, my friends, I talked to you about how this episode was going to have a Chicago theme. The reason, well, I'm a Chicago fanboy. I've always loved Chicago. Wanted to live here all my life, and 18, almost 19 years ago, finally moved to Chicago. I love it. My favorite place. And March 2025 is when this episode is released, and March is the anniversary of Chicago being incorporated as a city, specifically on March 4th, 1837. That date, March 4th, is easy to remember because if you write that date in the American standard format numerically, you get 3-4. 34 was Walter Payton's number on the Chicago Bears. How is that for a mnemonic for knowing the anniversary of the incorporation of Chicago? Having said that, is every March episode going to be Chicago-centric? Well, no, not necessarily. In fact, last March, there was nothing Chicago at all in the Auto Harp episode, but I just felt that for this year, I should probably honor Chicago's anniversary. And spoiler alert, in 2 years, I'll probably do a Chicago-themed March episode again. So I don't know. We'll see. But the truth is, a lot of the records that will be featured in this podcast will somehow be related to Chicago because a lot of the records that I have are either Chicago by topic or made, physically manufactured in the city of Chicago and not necessarily about Chicago itself. In fact, something I've found is that a good deal of these records I have are manufactured either in Chicago or New Jersey. So there you go. But having said that, in this episode, we're going to be taking a look at Mayor Daley on the Record, released in 1979. 40 minutes of speeches and other goodies about Chicago's perhaps most infamous mayor of modern times. So let's start looking at today's feature, shall we? Before we dive deeply into the record, it would help if I give you a bit of an idea of what Richard Joseph Daley was all about and what Chicago was like under his rule. I'm not going to get too deep into Mayor Daley. After all, there's a plethora of information out there about him. In Daley's Chicago, it was common knowledge that if a cop pulled you over, it would help your case if, when you handed him your driver's license, it was wrapped in a sawbuck. The University of Illinois at Chicago, or as it was known when it opened under Daley's watch, the University of Illinois Circle Campus. Well, it's located where it is because of Richard J. Daley. Despite the University of Illinois being interested in some ideal space they found downtown, Daley had them build a brand new campus on the near west side, and that required the demolition of an Italian neighborhood. Daley was also responsible for the placement of the Dan Ryan Expressway, which separates his lifelong Irish neighborhood of Bridgeport from Bronzeville, a neighborhood that got its name from its black population. Of course, it's just a coincidence that as a youth, Daley was a member of the Hamburg Athletic Club, which was, among other things, a street gang whose victims were black people from the neighborhood to Bridgeport's east, i.e. Bronzeville, and Italians from the neighborhood where the University of Illinois at Chicago, or UIC, was eventually built. Again, it's certainly just a coincidence. After all, when he was asked about the Hamburg Athletic Club early on in his political career, Daley insisted it was not a street gang, but a gentleman's social club. But the placements of UIC and the Dan Ryan strengthened the existing racial segregation that existed in the city and, sadly, still exists to a large degree to this day. What if you were a big-shot Hollywood director and wanted to film your latest movie in Daley's Chicago? Well, unless your big star was John Wayne, of whom Daley was a big fan, you'd be out of luck, because Daley refused to grant movie permits. You know why? Because in a second season episode of M Squad called The Jumper, which aired on January 30th, 1959, by the way, part of the plot depicted a Chicago cop accepting a bribe. That would never happen, so Daley got ticked off at that and would no longer allow anything to be filmed in Chicago.
Come on, Walker, you know what I'm talking about. They're paying off. Like you're paying Simmons.
That ban, however, was officially lifted in 1979 when Jane Byrne was mayor, and she allowed a little flick called The Blues Brothers to be filmed mostly in and around Chicago. Of course, most know of one of the biggest blemishes on Daley's reputation, how the 1968 Democratic National Convention and related activities, including protests, of course, how they were handled, what with having police and riot gear beating the living daylights out of unarmed protesters. Among those beaten by Chicago police, by the way, was a Catholic priest who just happened to be riding by on his bike on his way home, and cops pulled him off his bike and attacked him. But I would like to clarify one thing, though. It has been said that members of the press, including Dan Rather, were also attacked despite having legitimate press credentials. Well, that's simply not true. Not true at all. Members of the press were attacked because of their press credentials, not despite their press credentials. Daley ordered the press to be targeted with the logic that if they're beaten up, they'll be temporarily disabled and won't be able to report on the events. Wonder how that worked out. Those are just some of the questionable things you'd have to put up with in Daley's Chicago. Having said that, he was an absolute sweetheart compared to his predecessors, and by most accounts actually did significantly clean up a lot of corruption out of the city, relatively at least. Daley's more positive accomplishments include infrastructure improvement. Because of Daley, we have those expressways that Chicago is famous for, although there are many Chicagoans who are against motor vehicular traffic at all, and ergo don't see that as a positive, but just stay with me here. O'Hare International Airport, or as Daley always called it, O'Hara, is the major transportation hub that it is because of da Mare, as he was often called, D-A space M-A-R-E. If you're like me, and you love the Chicago skyline and are aware that it's the most awesome skyline on the planet, well, thank Mayor Daley. Because of him, we have such landmarks as the Sears Tower and the John Hancock Center. Some people hated Daley, some loved him, just like any other politician, I suppose. My opinion of him? Well, I don't want to get political, really, and in this case, I really don't have much of a right to, quite simply because I was only 2 years old when he died, and I literally don't remember him from his mayoral tenure at all. All I know is from what I've read about him, stories on TV, podcasts, whatever else have you. Having said that, I'll drop a few more facts about Mayor Daley. He was born on May 15th, 1902, and he lived his entire life in a modest, classic Chicago bungalow at South Low Avenue in Bridgeport on the city's south side, just blocks away from his beloved Chicago White Sox. He was such a big fan of the Sox that on September 22nd, 1959, mind you, in the height of the Cold War, when the White Sox won the American League pennant, Daley celebrated by having the air raid sirens in the city set off, unwittingly scaring the living daylights out of many Chicagoans. Daley was also a very devout Catholic and a parishioner of the Nativity of Our Lord Catholic Church just a block away from his home. His devotion to Roman Catholicism followed him through his entire education, having graduated from the Nativity of Our Lord's grade school, De La Salle Institute, and DePaul University, where he earned a Bachelor of Laws degree. One major addition to Chicago under Daley's watch was McCormick Place, the largest convention hall in North America. However, the steel and concrete building was somehow destroyed in a fire on January 16, 1967. Strange that a building of steel and concrete could burn down overnight, but at the time, there were some highly inflammable exhibits on the main floor, and guess what? There weren't any sprinklers on the main floor, and many of the fire hydrants were turned off, so undoubtedly that contributed to this fire going out of control. McCormick Place was rebuilt on the same site in 1971 with the original Airy Crown Theater that was inside the convention center still intact. In 1970, famed Chicago newspaper columnist Mike Royko wrote an unauthorized biography of Daley called Boss, and that book spent 26 weeks on the New York Times bestseller list in 1971. And that was despite, or possibly even because of, Daley's wife, Eleanor Sis Daley. She had a mobster-style quoted nickname. She called the book trash and shallow secondhand hogwash. Sis saw the book in her local grocery store. It was a store called National Food Store. She spoke with the store's manager and demanded that the book no longer be offered for sale there, or she'd never shop there again. Well, as a result, the entire National Food Store chain withdrew the book, only to eventually make it available again. And despite Mayor Daley's reputation as a staunch Democrat, by the way, he actually started his political career as a Republican. But during his career as a Democrat, he spent some time as the chairman of the Central Committee of the Cook County Democratic Party, including during some of his mayoral tenure. Many say that it was because of Daley and his intense dedication to the Democratic Party that John F. Kennedy won the electoral vote in Illinois and clinched the presidential election. In fact, according to Mike Royko in his book Boss, Chicago polling places on Election Day 1960 would have assistants who would go into the voting booth and help you vote, because voting is such a confusing process. Daley was what many people would term a mayor for life, which was literally true. Once he was elected mayor of Chicago in 1955, by the way, there's a famous picture of him arriving at his office in City Hall the first day on the job with a clock above him showing 9:05, late to work on his first day. Of course, that picture is so famous that I could not find it at the time that I recorded this, but if I find it, I will definitely share it. But anyway, he was elected 6 times to be mayor of Chicago, but that 6th term was cut short by his death from a massive heart attack on December 20th, 1976. That made him the second longest serving mayor in Chicago history with a 21-year tenure. So far, that record has been beaten only by his son, Richard M. Daley, whose tenure began in 1989 and ended in 2011, and it's likely he would have at least run again had his wife Maggie not fallen ill with cancer. The things that I mentioned here about Richard J. Daley don't even begin to scratch the surface about his life, his career, and whatnot. But the fact is, this is a podcast episode, and I like to keep it between 60 and 90 minutes. So if you have even the slightest curiosity about Daley, I urge you to read one of the many books that have been written about him or watch a documentary or two. In fact, I will link Mike Royko's book in the show notes at myweirdrecords.fab4it.com in case you'd like to order a copy. Regardless of how you feel about Daley, good or bad, Boss is a wonderful, fascinating read, as is just about any book about Mayor Daley, I believe. Another thing you can do, well, you can listen to an album called Mayor Daley on the Record. So let's talk about that. Big challenge with doing this podcast is that the records that I talk about aren't exactly your run-of-the-mill discs that you're likely to have in your collection. Whether you're a casual listener of vinyl or you're a die-hard collector with a dozen IKEA Colex cases jam-packed with albums. Of course, this means that, well, it's often very difficult to find information about these records. such as how and when they were originally recorded and released and whatnot. But with this month's featured record, I am extremely thankful that I live in the city of Chicago. And believe me, I have a myriad of other reasons I'm thankful for living in Chicago. And as a Chicago resident, I have a Chicago Public Library card. One of the benefits having a library card affords me is access to the Chicago Tribune archive. I mean, yeah, anybody could walk into the Harold Washington branch downtown and go through the microfilm reels, but the library's website actually has a searchable digital archive. Put in search terms and you get articles that match your terms. Thanks to that online access to not only the Tribune archives, but also the Chicago Sun-Times archives, I was able to learn some information about the album that I otherwise would not have been able to find. Now, the album was compiled and narrated by Bill Cameron. I did not need to do research with either of the Chicago newspapers to know that. It says so on the back of the album cover. Bill Cameron at the time was in his 8th year of a 30-year run as a reporter for WMAQ Radio, which was Chicago's NBC affiliate. He then moved on to WLS's AM radio station, from where he retired only about 3 years ago. Those of you listening in the future, that's 3 years ago from 2025. In more recent years, Cameron hosted a couple of podcasts, but he put together Mayor Daley on the Record in October 1978 in WMAQ's studios at Chicago's famed Merchandise Mart. When in October? Well, I know that it was recorded in October 1978 thanks to the close-up column in the Chicago Tribune written by Dorothy Collin, who sadly passed away earlier this year. She discussed Mayor Daley on the Record in her October 20th, 1978 column. That was a Friday. She said that she sat in on a session for the Record on Thursday, so I am guessing she meant October 19th, the previous day, or theoretically even October 12th. The heading on her column was, "Here's Daley, malaprops and all, at 33 1/3 RPM. The word malaprops in the title refers to Mayor Daley's tendency to, well, speak incorrectly.
Congratulations again to the association, and thanks very much for your help and your assistance, and may the 70 New Deal be as successful as the 1932 New Deal was."
As Cameron said on the Record,
"You didn't always understand what Mayor Daley said, but you always understood what he meant."
Case in point, you have heard this little soundbite in my podcast's intro, and as of right now, that soundbite is being retired from the intro, and there will be a new one in its place, starting with the next episode. Here's the one I'm talking about.
Gentlemen, get the thing straight once and for all. The policeman isn't there to create disorder. The policeman is there to preserve disorder.
That little malapropism you just heard was included on the very beginning of Side 2 in a section titled, appropriately enough, Malapropisms. Fittingly enough, Mayor Daley's press agent Earl Bush once told the media, "Don't print what he said, print what he meant." Now, according to Dorothy Collin, the album was put together using tapes that Bill Cameron kept of Daley's various press conferences and speeches and such, and he also tracked down recordings he didn't already have. Now, Dorothy Collin quotes Bill Cameron as saying, "What I'm attempting is not a critique of Daley, but to show Daley at his most heated, his most poignant, his funniest. He was the best stand-up comedian in town, sometimes on purpose. I'm just stringing together the Daleyisms, the malapropisms, the singing of Melody of Love with Bobby Vinton."
Love you with all my heart, return to me, and always be my melody of life.
Indeed, as Cameron says on the album, Richard Daley was a big fan of Bobby Vinton. Such a big fan that he skipped a dinner he was invited to by the King of Norway so that he could attend a Bobby Vinton concert. But going back to what Bill Cameron said about what he was attempting to do by compiling the record, yeah, when you listen to the record, you're going to hear Daley seemingly make a fool of himself, but you will also hear him charm the hell out of the press. And you'd certainly understand why he had his fans. Bill Cameron also was quoted as saying, "I respected him even though I disagreed with the way he conducted his office. I liked him very much, and I loved that chortle. I really miss the guy." Now, as for me, friends, I remember when I found this record. It was in the fall of 2011, probably October, definitely not November. I saw it at Reckless Records. Reckless has 3 locations in Chicago and 1 in London. Been to all 4, by the way. But I found this record at their Wicker Park location on the near north side, same place where I found Lil Wally's Polish Sex record covered back in episode 12. As a 4th-generation Northsider and general Chicago fanboy, I felt it was my duty to purchase the record. I paid $9.99 for it, and a few days later I posted a picture of my proud find to my Facebook timeline, prompting this comment from one of my friends. Why does this infamous mayor have a record? 3 question marks. WTF is on it. After listening to the record, I responded, to answer your question, a lot of yelling.
Now they want to stand behind the great university cloak and tell how wrong our country is, how wrong our society is, when they know nothing about it and refuse to take any steps to correct it, and haven't got the guts to make the charge on this floor of what's wrong with this young man.
Now, this is an audio podcast, so I should probably give you a visual description of the album. The front cover has an illustration of Mayor Daley smiling, and that's kind of off to the right a little bit. The illustration is over an olive green background, and over the entire cover is a series of concentric circles, undoubtedly representing the fact that this is a record. Near the top of the cover, there's a banner made of kind of sort of rainbow horizontal stripes, and on that banner there's a green drawing of the Chicago skyline. Even for 1978, it wasn't an up-to-date skyline because the Sears Tower is not part of it. The title is on the bottom of the cover, all lowercase in a white Arial font face. It says Mayor Daley on record, all in a small size, except for the word Daley, which is in a huge font size. The back cover also has an olive green background, and in the middle third of the cover, there are 2 black and white pictures. The one on the left is of Bill Cameron, and there's a blurb below it written by WMAQ General Manager Bert Sherwood. The picture on the right is of Cameron speaking with Daley with a microphone in front of him. Below the picture, there are several quotes, a few from Chicago media, a few from some political figures. Let me read a few for you. Let's see. I remember Mayor Daley most fondly for his laugh and his real sense of fun. It didn't come out too often in public, but that was the real Daley. And that's from Jack Mabley of the Chicago Tribune. John Calloway from WTTW-TV, that's the PBS station here. He says, I always wanted to cover Chairman Mao, but covering Chairman and Mayor Richard J. Daley was surely the next most interesting and confounding assignment in the world. See, Bob Crawford from WBBM Radio said, call him a great mayor, but remember the price. And I found this one particularly interesting. What I admired most about Richard J. Daley was his ability to relate to anyone from street sweeper to president. He was able to do this because he could separate the extraneous titles and PR from the actual man or woman. He simply was not impressed by anything phony. The person who said that was Jane Byrne, former Chicago Commissioner of Consumer Affairs. And of course, what is not written here is future mayor. I was surprised to see that quote from her on the back because I know that at least with Richard M. Daley, Mayor Daley's son, she always clashed and they never had kind words for each other. But anyway, getting back to the record itself. On the upper third of the back cover, there's a write-up from Harry Golden Jr. from the Chicago Sun-Times. If you look at the upper left corner, you'll see the title of the album, Mayor Daley on the Record, in a bold sans serif font, and the lower left has a very small album design credit, specifically Lloyd Design Associates. That's LLOY Design, all one word. Now, the record itself, it's pretty no frills. It's just a very thin black vinyl 12-incher with red labels and plain black sans serif text. There's no record company credited, but instead, there's a tiny note on the bottom of the label with the Circle P sound recording copyright symbol, followed by the words 1978 National Broadcasting Company, Inc., all rights reserved. Remember, WMAQ is an NBC affiliate. We know the record was pressed by the MCA pressing plant in Pinckneyville, Illinois, just about 30 miles or so outside of St. Louis. How do we know that, though? Because in the run out at the end of each album side, there's a capital letter P surrounded by 2 diamond-shaped boxes etched in the vinyl, which means that it was pressed at that plant, which before being an MCA plant was a Decca plant. The record plant closed for business in 2007, and the building is now the home of GDB International. Fun fact for you. Getting back to the record, the label shows WMAQ 670 on the left side of the label on both sides of the record, with 33 1/3 RPM written immediately below. Those of you who are not familiar with Chicago media, that notation WMAQ 670 is not a catalog number, but simply the call sign of the WMAQ radio station, followed by its frequency on the AM dial. That station in recent years has turned into WSCR, The Score, which is a sports station. On the right side of the label, there is a side indicator written in title case. Above the spindle hole, you have the title in all capital letters and in quotation marks, and underneath that, you have smaller letters in title case that reads, reported by Bill Cameron, and then right under that, there's another notation that says WMAQ NBC Radio News. Now, here's the thing, folks. Below the spindle hole, there's what appears to be a track listing, but the way the record was banded, there aren't individual tracks. There are no rills. It's just one continuous track, just one large band on each side. I'm not sure whether the titles listed are meant to be interpreted as separate tracks or simply topics that are covered on the album side. For what it's worth, the topics do appear to be listed at least roughly in order as they appear on the actual record. So I'll go through those topics or tracks or whatever right now. On side 1, the first listed topic or track is Hizzoner, spelled Hizzoner, one of the many nicknames that Mayor Daley had, along with Da Mayor and Da Boss. This part seems to be more or less an introduction to the world of Mayor Daley. The next topic is 1968, which talks about 2 pretty tumultuous events that Daley was criticized for, to say the least, and how he handled them. Riots that broke out in the wake of Martin Luther King's assassination, and the protests that happened during the Democratic National Convention. The next topic listed is presidents, and for this topic, Bill Cameron talks about and presents how Mayor Daley hobnobbed with U.S. presidents over the years, both Democratic and Republican. After that, we have rivals and another topic called political philosophy, and that's the end of side 1, and as I mentioned before, side 2 starts with malapropisms, which discusses Daley's infamous habit of mangling the English language, and of course there are a few sound samples included. Other topics listed on side 2 are campaigning, the Daley machine, race relations, children and family life, sports and fishing, Daley host to dignitaries, and epilogue. The first copy of Mayor Daley on the Record was presented on Thursday, March 15th, 1979 to Jim Thompson, who was the governor of Illinois at the time. The album was released to the public a week later, and the profits went to the Crusade of Mercy, which was a charity that was later merged into the United Way of Metropolitan Chicago. The March 16, 1979 edition of the Chicago Sun-Times announced the album's impending release in a write-up titled, "This disc might top the charts," undoubtedly mocking Mayor Daley's pronounced Chicago accent.
We're not in the convention. We don't know who the candidates are, and he's asking me a question. Who are you going to nominate?
The following week, the Sun-Times had another brief write-up about the record on the editorial page under the title, "But Can He Pronounce Wonderful?" WUNNERFUL. Again, taking a shot at Mayor Daley's speech habits. The write-up read, "But our point is not a pitch, rather a word to those who think Chicagoese lost its sparkle with the passing of the man who said, 'I resent the insinuendos,' and 'Together we must rise to ever higher and higher platitudes,' and 'It is amazing what they will be able to do once they get the atom harassed.'" The author goes on to say that thanks to Alderman Bert Nateris, Malapropisms had not died out of Chicago politics with the death of Mayor Daley, quoting Notaris as saying, "It's bound to be one of the most high-volume fast food outlets in the United States, and letting them in there would be the tip of the camel's back." So that's a little bit of background about Mayor Daley and the album Mayor Daley on the Record and what you'll hear on it. As I usually do, I digitized the record, cleaned it up as best as I could, and if I don't say so myself, I think I did a pretty good job on this one. And I uploaded it to my YouTube channel so you can go there and hear the entire contents of the album. By the way, this was not the only record of Chicago politics that Bill Cameron put together. He also did Remembering Harold, Harold being Harold Washington, Chicago's first ever black mayor, Blago's Greatest Hits, as in Rod Blagojevich, former governor of Illinois, who was very much ousted, and Mayor Daley's Greatest Hits. Mayor Daley's Greatest Hits does have a few samples of Richard J. Daley on it, but it's actually a compilation of Richard M. Daley and some of his most memorable speeches and sayings.
There's aldermanic prerogative, but when it comes to a statement that kids are not welcome to Grant Park, that's not an aldermanic prerogatory.
So having said all that, let's move on to Sean's record collecting thoughts. It occurred to me when I was polling at Mayor Daley on the Record for my collection for this episode that there's a pretty basic concept in record collecting that I have not yet talked about: how to actually store your records. I've talked about putting records in inner sleeves and outer sleeves and such, but what do you do with them after that? What I'm about to discuss is more or less how I store my records, and not necessarily recommendations, but just what I do and maybe some suggestions. But before I get into any detail, the one thing I have to say is however you store your records, the absolute most important first thing to do is make sure that you keep them in a cool, dry place. Don't stash them in your unfinished basement or your attic. Also, keep them out of direct sunlight. And that includes if you happen to have any framed records on your wall because, well, sunlight will cause the colors to fade. So that's the most important thing, cool and dry. But what about the actual storage? People of a certain age are well familiar with those all-in-one audio systems that had a turntable, a radio, a cassette deck, and maybe even a CD player and a standalone graphic equalizer. Those systems usually came in a little tower that actually had record storage under it. Those were, and maybe still are, fine for some people, but what about people like me, who have a lot more records than will actually fit in those things? My storage technique basically reflects two things. Number one, how frequently I listen to certain types of records. And number two, the space I have in my home with its overall layout. My wife and I have our records stored in 2 rooms and our hallway. And I will explain that along the way. The most commonly played records in our home are generally in our living room, where the turntable is. We keep our Beatles albums in a bookcase my wife's grandfather built many decades ago, mainly because that bookcase serves as our Beatles and Beach Boys research case, as it were. We have our Beatles and Beach Boys CDs, DVDs, Blu-rays, etc. in that case, as well as about 80% of the books we have related to both of those bands. One of the shelves has enough vertical height for record albums, just enough space to very comfortably fit our Beatles collection. You know those Billy bookcases from IKEA? Well, we have 5 of those along one of the walls in our living room. We have 2 tall ones and then 3 short ones in the middle. We keep records in the bottom shelves of the 3 shorter shelves. They fit quite well. Of course, the beauty of the Billy bookcases is that you can adjust the shelves to whatever heights you want, but whatever the case, they've been holding up quite well for 18 years. It was the Billy bookcases, by the way, that made me realize I really need to keep the album covers in outer sleeves because, well, if you pull a record off of a shelf and it slides along the bottom, that's friction that wears away on the bottom of the record cover. So you got to be careful there. Now, speaking of IKEA, by the way, they have a piece of furniture that has proven to be a dream come true for many record collectors. The Kallax storage cubes, Kallax. By the way, I got my pronunciation from Google Translate. One Kallax cube measures roughly 16 inches all around, making it ideal for album storage. And the Kallax cases come in numerous colors and sizes and configurations. We have one, and it has two cubes, one on top of the other. Our Kallax is in the hallway right by our front door, and that's where we keep our Beach Boys, surf music. By the way, very, very little of the Beach Boys output has anything to do with the beach, let alone surfing. And we also keep in the Kallax a genre that Lisa and I have dubbed tacky. The tacky category includes lounge, Herb Alpert, space-age bachelor pad music, stuff like that. When I brought the Kallax home and set it up where I did, Lisa said, "This works. I like it." I will, of course, link the Kallax in my show notes on the My Weird Record Collection website at myweirdrecords.fab4it.com. I do disclaim this. If you do visit that link and end up buying anything, I get absolutely no commission at all from the sale. I just simply like these storage units quite a lot, as do many other record collectors. And Lord knows if I had the room, I'd get more. Now, one thing that I will link that I will get a little bit of a commission on is what I use to store the records that I discuss in this podcast. I have no idea how the brand name is supposed to be pronounced, so I'm probably butchering the pronunciation, but it's Ibvivic, Ibvivic, and it's always spelled all capital letters. The product description is, and I quote, vinyl record storage box with lids and handle. Another description I saw is vinyl album storage case bag for 12-inch LP. That second description is actually more accurate. It's more like a bag, but with a flat bottom. It's made out of Oxford, and it has two handles that you pick up on either side and basically hold them in one hand. Very easy to carry around and move. And I like them because they're quick and easy. They're not the fanciest thing in the world, but perfectly fine for my purposes. You just have to remember not to put anything on top of those cases because, well, the lid is just a thin piece of Oxford fabric. You can fit about 30 albums, give or take, in those things. The back of the case has a slot where you can actually store a couple of 7-inch records, too. That came in handy for me. I have 4 of these cases, and I store them on a bookcase in the room where I am recording this podcast, actually. Again, they're easy to pick up and move around. Oh, and because one of the cases only has a few records in it, I use the rest of the space in that one case to put Christmas albums. I mean, after all, we only listen to Christmas music for about a month out of the year, so we don't need immediate access to those albums all the time. Now, the link I'm going to put in the show notes and already have on the website in the Stuff I Recommend section is to Amazon, and I do get a little bit of a commission from any sales from that link, but I know that as of the recording of this episode, there are a lot of folks boycotting Amazon, and I totally understand. If you'd rather not patronize Amazon, then I would recommend first contacting your local used record store if you're lucky enough to have one and see if they can get you those cases. And if not, there are other sources, a few of them, not a lot. I know you can find them on eBay, but it might be worth checking other sources. And again, the spelling is Ibvivic. Finally, there's one other piece of album storage that we have in our house, a wooden beer crate. It's ideal for storing about 30 albums, maybe a few more. And also there's a bit of room off to the side in the crate so you can store some small accessories if you want. I have a few old school CD long boxes in the one we have. Once, when I went shopping for more of these things, though, I found that they were extremely expensive. The thing is, the crate is actually Lisa's, so it's kind of mine through marriage. I guess it's my crate-in-law. And I thought she got it at a flea market for dirt cheap. So I asked her, and she said, no, I didn't get it from a flea market. That's a crate from a tavern that my great-grandparents ran back in North Jersey. But whatever the case, it's a beautiful crate, and we have it in the hallway next to the Kallax, and it's under an end table. Right now, we have our comedy records in there, mainly because for our various storage techniques, it was the ideal storage for the number of comedy albums that we have. Now, everything I talked about is all fine and dandy for album storage, but what about singles? Well, our singles are in small cases that are made of imitation leather or maybe even vinyl. They're tan and they're pretty old school, pretty typical for 7-inch record storage. They have a little push-button insert thingy with a flip top with a plastic handle, and they work quite well. We also have a couple of vintage metal singles containers that we got for cheap as well. They work the same way, the little flip top. I think a couple of them might actually have the little metal flippy things that lock in place. Now, where we actually store these things, well, all I can say is I'm very thankful for the obsolescence of audio cassettes. I mean, yeah, they're kind of coming back in a way, but the fact is, Lisa and I haven't listened to audio cassettes in decades. When that realization hit me, I took the cassette deck out of our entertainment center that contains our TiVo, yes, they still make those, receiver and CD player, and then I readjusted the shelving so that there was enough space that our singles boxes could fit in perfectly. Well, almost perfectly. There wasn't room enough for all the singles boxes, but I had a solution for that. Our speakers sit on a couple of plant stands of all things that I got again at IKEA. I'm not going to link these stands in the show notes because they're plant stands and not everybody basically, if you want to go to IKEA and find these plant stands that we use for speaker stands, they're called Lantiv, Lantiv. The cool thing about those plant stands is that at the bottom, there's a shelf. So guess what? Those 2 singles boxes that wouldn't fit in our entertainment center, I put those on the shelf on one of the plant stands. So that's what I do with albums and singles. Oh, but what about 10-inch records? Yes, I do have a small handful of them, but there's a problem. I don't have enough 10-inchers to justify buying storage for them, but I had to come up with a way to store them somehow. My solution, the other plant stand that supports the other speaker. I have the 10-inchers on the shelf on the bottom of the plant stand. I got the idea because I saw that Lisa has a huge jar of seashells on that same shelf, and there was exactly enough room for all of my 10-inch records, and the frame of the plant makes a nice bookend. And it's not that I squeezed them in. There's still a little bit of breathing room, so that was a perfect solution for now. Of course, there are other ways you can store your records. For example, before Lisa and I moved in together, I actually kept my records in cardboard boxes that I got from Bags Unlimited. No frills, white boxes, and they come in various sizes to accommodate various record sizes. But the fact is, they worked. They have built-in handles, so they're easy to pick up and move. The only thing is, I got rid of them long ago because Lisa said they were ugly and she didn't want those ugly record things in her house. She wanted something nicer. But trust me, if you don't mind something that's very plain, no frills, those cardboard boxes from Bags Unlimited, they work great. And of course, I will put links in the show notes and in the Stuff I Recommend section of the podcast website. And a segment about storing records would not be complete if I did not mention milk crates. Milk crates are a very popular method of storing records, especially albums. They're not the most attractive things in the world, but as with Bags Unlimited boxes, they sure do the job quite well. I'm not going to link anything in the show notes for milk crates. You can find them all over the place, and you might even be able to happen upon a few for free every now and then. But going back to those IBVIC storage cases, IBV, oh, what the heck are they called? IBVIC. Those things with the handles and the, not canvas, the Oxford felt fabric. I found those when I was looking for record storage solutions after I had a vintage record box that when I picked it up, one side of the handle broke clean off the box and it was irreparable. And the box wasn't even full either. So if you're thinking of using a vintage case that has a handle on it, remember, it's old. It might have worn out. Make sure the handle is good and solid, or else your records could have a pretty tragic accident. Thankfully, when I picked up the box and the handle broke off, it was only about an inch off the table, so the records in it were unscathed. And honestly, if I had my druthers, I would have replaced that case with one of those fancy record cases that have the metal trim on them. Those things are pretty sweet. Just one problem, they're also hella expensive. You'll be looking at spending between 70 and 90 bucks a pop on those things. They're rated for storing 50 records. They're attractive, they're sturdy. There are many brands and they're available for all sizes of records, and chances are your local record store will have at least one variety in stock. So if you really want to spend that kind of money, go for it. And I'm currently on the job market, so if you do have that kind of money to spend on those things, let me know where you're working, if they need a software engineer, and get back to me. But one thing I do want to specifically recommend against using for your records, though, are those circular-shaped singles cases, because those things are designed to carry bare singles stacked. If you have any bare records, your first job is to get sleeves for those things. I urge you to get poly sleeves or poly-lined sleeves rather than plain paper sleeves. The poly sleeves will not scratch records, unlike paper sleeves, and they will help reduce static buildup. Now, most record experts will tell you to never stack your records, and I, for one, wholeheartedly agree. But the thing is, singles might be a slightly different story. They're built with a little bit more rigidity, I guess. And here's why. They were actually originally invented so that they could be stacked on stacking record players. And if you take a close look at most 7-inch singles, they're actually a little bit thicker and sturdier when you get to the label because, well, again, they're meant to be stacked. And a lot of the labels on a 7-inch or a 45, whatever you want to call them, they have ridges so that way the records that are stacked can interlock with each other so they won't slip. It'll reduce the chances of slipping. So they're actually built for stacking, believe it or not. But it's not the stacking that bothers me about those circular cases. It's basically because you're forced to put bare uncovered singles in there, and that's not good. You'll scratch them up possibly. And just don't do it. Don't do it. Okay. If you want to get one of those circular singles cases because they look cool and retro, fine, get them for decoration or something. Just don't put records in them. Put something else in them, if anything. So those are my thoughts on record storage. Now, if you have any creative or practical ways of storing records that you'd like to share with me and or your fellow listeners, drop me a line. For those of you who are new to this podcast, I like to give each record that I review a rating, just to give you an idea of how interesting I find it or however you see it. And for you folks, I will explain my rating system. Each record gets rated on a scale of 1 through 5 inclusive on 5 factors, which of course means that each record is going to have a composite score of between 5 and 25 inclusive. Now, if you hear that clicking around, that's my beagle Lola. Anywho, back to the ratings. The first thing I rate on is either local interest or usefulness, or sometimes I take an average of both, but it depends on what is actually on the record. I also take into account historical interest, that is, does the record kind of give you an idea of what the times were like at the time it was made? And here comes Lola again. I really should close the door to this little studio. Anyway, I also rate records on their weirdness, their uniqueness, and their enjoyability, not necessarily in that order. Now, I don't know exactly how an album of sound bites of a mayor who was dead for 2 years before it was released can be considered necessarily useful. So I'm just going to consider the local interest, which is, well, quite honestly, off the chart when it comes to Mayor Daley on the record. I feel that if you're a Chicagoan, or at least have the slightest interest in Chicago, you need this record in your collection, especially if you want to hear a genuine Chicago accent. Pardon me, genuine Chicago accent.
I said to the superintendent, if a man has a Molotov cocktail in his hand, you remember at that time they were throwing a lot of them around, and throws it into a building with children and women up above, he should be shot right there. And if I was there, I'd shoot him.
Definitely 5 out of 5 for local interest. How about historical interest? Holy cow. Daley was quite a historic figure, making headlines across the United States, not just Chicago. I mean, the dude is rumored to have won the election for JFK, despite the later denial by his son. Love him or hate him, though, for better or for worse, this record gives you bits of Daley from a wide range of years, covering a wide range of emotions, too. I'm giving Mayor Daley on the record a historical interest rating also of 5. As for uniqueness, well, insofar as there is such a thing as a degree of being unique, I'm going to be honest, I'm not quite sure exactly how to rate this factor, or at least I had a really hard time deciding. I was tempted to go as low as 1, believe it or not, simply because I do see it a lot at used record stores, but then it occurred to me, he's one of the most well-known Chicago mayors, and the record stores where I've seen this record were all in Chicago. But I checked eBay, Discogs, Amazon, and Etsy for copies being offered for sale, and all 4 of those sites had at least one. And at least among the copies on eBay and Etsy, I saw a pretty good handful offered for sale, and only 1 copy was actually from Chicago. The rest were from pretty far away, including a couple from Oregon of all places. Discogs.com shows that 82 people claim to have this record in their collections. I'm one of them, of course, and there are 18 available for sale as of March 6th, 2025. That number didn't really surprise me, again, because I've seen a lot of copies of this album in my travels. I still believe that this record did not get a lot of distribution outside the Chicago metro area, and I believe that those copies that I found that were being offered for sale nowhere near Chicago could have simply just migrated their way across the country over the past 46 years. But whatever the case, the fact is, if you want Mayor Daley on the record, you will be able to find it somewhere, most likely for a pretty low price, like about $10. The copy I saw on Etsy was being offered for $66, but it was unopened, so that might have something to do with it. But even the subject matter itself, a record dedicated to the mayor of a major city, that itself is not unique. I found another record dedicated to a famous or maybe even infamous mayor that will certainly get some coverage on a future episode of this podcast. Taking all this into consideration, I will give the uniqueness rating of Mayor Daley on the record a 2. Of course, my dear friends, this podcast is called My Weird Record Collection, so I should rate the record's weirdness factor, right? Tell you what, this record is fairly easy-ish to find, and it's not the only mayoral album, but it's still kind of weird, a 1979 record that's mainly a collection of sound samples from a mercurial politician. I mentioned how I'm a huge Chicago fanboy, and if you follow me on the social media, you already know that very well. But it wasn't just the connection to Chicago that made me buy the record. If that were the case, I'd need a whole warehouse for the Chicago-related records I see in the wild. When I saw this record for sale, my first reaction was, oh my God. The fact that I had that reaction tells me that weirdness was the motivating factor. Also, given the reactions when I posted on social media when I bought this thing, it's definitely an oddity, a curiosity. So I'll go a bit high on this one and rate it 4 out of 5 for weirdness. Finally, of course, we have the enjoyability factor. I don't know, it might just be my love of Chicago, but I enjoyed this record from start to finish. I laughed at Daley's mangling of the English language. The thick Chicago accent is wonderful. And to hear him screaming at people, it just makes me so thankful that I was born after sound recording technology was invented. So obviously, I'm going to give Mayor Daley on the record an enjoyability rating of 4. Wait, 4? Why not 5? You love it so much, don't you? Excellent question, dear listener. I have to ding it for what I consider a major, disappointing omission. As you heard before, Daley was well known for habitually saying O'Hara when he was referring to O'Hare International Airport. Tragically, the record does not have any instances of Daley saying O'Hara. Hard to believe that in 21 years of mayorhood, there were no instances of Daley saying O'Hara among the recordings that Bill Cameron had access to. And my search on YouTube proved fruitless, by the way. Might be there, but it was just hard to find. But going back over those ratings, 5 for local interest, 5 for historical interest, 2 for uniqueness, 4 for weirdness, and 4 for enjoyability gives Mayor Daley on the record a composite rating of 20, a rating that's in a 3-way tie with Hear How to Plan the Perfect Dinner Party by Gaynor and Dorothy Maddox and Polish Sex by Chicago's very own Lil Wally. I'm going to place Mayor Daley on the record ahead of both of those two, placing it in the top 3 records covered in this podcast. That, my friends, was Mayor Daley on the record and my thoughts and discoveries about the album. You can reach out to me with any thoughts you have on this record or anything else relevant to this podcast, and I'll tell you about next month's episode after I tell you how you can send your thoughts, and I will give credit where credit is due, of course. My email address is myweirdrecords@fab4it.com. Fab4IT is spelled F-A-B, the number 4, I-T. The website for this podcast, by the way, is very similar, but instead of the @ what you're going to put in the URL bar of your web browser is myweirdrecords.fab4it.com. And by the way, while you're there, consider supporting this podcast. You'll see a little button that says, Buy Me a Coffee. Don't tell the powers that be, but I'm probably not going to use that supportive money to buy a coffee. I'm not a coffee drinker. I'll probably get iced tea instead. But our little secret. I'm also on various social networks where my handle is My Weird Records. That includes Twitter, Blue Sky, Instagram. I think I have an account on Hive, but I am terrible at checking it. I apologize, those of you who might be looking for me there. And I'm also on Facebook. I'm on that social network as well. You can simply do a search for My Weird Record Collection, or you can go directly to facebook.com/myweirdrecords. Also, this podcast has a YouTube presence. You can get the episodes there, as well as extra videos that have nothing to do with the actual podcast episodes. Well, I don't want to say that. That may or may not have to do with the podcast episodes, let's just say. And also, I tend to put audio of the records that I talk about on my YouTube channel, including Mayor Daley on the record. You can go to YouTube and search for My Weird Record Collection and hit like and subscribe and whatever else they tell you to do. Smash that button or something. I don't know. But anyway, you could do that or go directly to youtube.com/@My Weird Record Collection. By the way, the sounds and music used in this podcast are the property of their respective copyright holders and are used for commentary and review. Infringement is not intended. Huge thank you to my friend Tim Christ, also known as Shoebox, for allowing me the use of his record, The Pac-Man EP, a wonderful listen. I used that record as the basis for the logo of this podcast, and Tim and his unforgettable music can be found on his website at worm-quartet.web.app. Got his most recent album, Carpe Tedium. It is fantastic, and I laugh so hard, too. It's both great music and entertaining. So anyway, also special thanks to another talented musician who's also got an amazing sense of humor, Kevin Zerb. Kevin designed the logo artwork for this podcast using Tim's record. But anyway, Kevin and his music and his podcasts, including his latest one called Mono, are available on the web at Zerbinator.com. Check it out. And something that I realized when I did this episode is that I've done too many episodes in a row that deal with 100% spoken word records. So for the next episode, I'm going to change things up and do a record that is entirely music. It's going to be one that I found on my most recent trip to London. And if you follow me closely and watch my videos, you might have a guess as to which record it is. But anyway, check out the podcast on April 15th, 2025 or later. And you'll hear what I have to talk about. So until then, this is Sean reminding you, support your local record store.
You're talking about politics? I told you when I come down here, we're not talking about struggling at control of the party. I'm not struggling for anyone. I'm not a candidate for any office. I won and won 6 times. I'm down here to talk for the kids of Illinois, and I don't give a damn who likes it. But let me ask. No!